Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Last week we noted that Solomon put everything he wrote in chapters 1 and 2 in context with what he wrote here in chapter 3 because he knew his readers may misunderstand his early emphasis on vanity. By emphasizing that everything is vain, that all things are vain, he understood that his readers may misinterpret those words as being the words of an extreme position, a negative position influenced by a backslidden heart. And so for that reason, I believe he wrote Ecclesiastes 3, verse number 1. To everything there is a season, and there is a time to every purpose under the heaven. I added those words, there is, so you can understand what he's saying. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven. By declaring everything under the sun vain, he was declaring everything temporary. By declaring everything under the sun vain, he was declaring everything lacking, it's unfulfilling, it's not satisfactory, and it cycles over and over, and for that reason it's not a permanent solution to our desire for satisfaction. But by declaring everything under the sun vain, he wasn't declaring everything under the sun to be without purpose, to be without point, or to be without pleasure. Indeed, he would write in verses 2 through 8 that everything has a place in life. Everything has destiny under the sun. Everything, both good and bad, has a place in life on our planet. Verse 2, a time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to get and a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to cast away. A time to rend and a time to sow. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time of war and a time of peace. He wrote all these things under the inspiration of God, and after he wrote these intriguing words, he asks a question for our sake, for the sake of the reader. He asks a question that we will be asking, or we should be asking, and then he answers it with his insight for, again, our benefit. He says in verse 9, or he asks, what profit hath he that worketh in that wherein he laboreth? What's the point, essentially? Why do what we're doing if all of these things are in place? Well, he tells us in verse 10, he says, I have seen the travail which God hath given to the sons of men to be exercised in it. I've seen it all, dear reader. And this is my conclusion, verse 11, He, God, hath made everything beautiful in His time. By teaching his readers that everything under the sun possesses beauty, not just vanity, he is putting everything he wrote in chapters 1 and 2 in true context. Just because everything under the sun is lacking in long-lasting satisfaction, that doesn't mean that anything under the sun is lacking in beauty and in purposeful pleasure. Everything, both the good and the bad, when done in God's time and seen from God's perspective, has beauty. God uses what we perceive to be bad to accomplish His eternal purposes in our lives. We struggle with that truth. Solomon certainly spent plenty of time vetting that truth, and so he adds to verse 11, He that hath made everything beautiful in His time, also, he writes, He, God, hath set the world in their heart, referring to us. He has set the world in their heart so that no man can find out the work that God maketh from the beginning to the end. God has designed our mind to have a world of endless thoughts, a world of endless consideration, a world of curiosity in the human mind. And because God is beyond our comprehension, and because our mind is full of so many thoughts, so many curious thoughts, we cannot possibly understand the why of everything. We cannot possibly understand why God does what He does from beginning to end. And so, everything under the sun possesses mystery. But it possesses more than beauty and mystery. It possesses opportunity. Verse number 12, he writes, I know that there is no good in them referring to the times, all the things that have been ordained for mankind. I know that there is no good in them but for a man to rejoice and to do good in his life, and also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God. These verses that we're reading now, again, shed some positive light on chapters 1 and 2. It tells us that Ecclesiastes is not a book full of words of a disgruntled, disenchanted king. No, these are the wise observations and conclusions of an experienced king. But with opportunity comes responsibility. Verse number 14. I know that whatsoever God doeth, it shall be forever. Nothing can be put to it, nor anything taken from it. And God doeth it, that men should fear before him. That which hath been is now, and that which is to be hath already been. And God requireth that which is past. It tells us here in these verses that the theme of the book is not the vanity of life, but the fear of God. If we focus on the things of this world, we will find ourselves unfulfilled, lacking in true pleasure and satisfaction. But if we fear God in everything in life, we will find ourselves at the place of true pleasure, the place of true satisfaction. Now, as good as these first 15 verses of chapter 3 are, he's not done yet, fortunately. These verses put the first 2 chapters in context, but he's not done writing. He's going to address that one thing that trips most of us up when it comes to enjoying life and accepting the mystery of God's work. Yes, this is going to be within the context of everything under the sun. It's going to be within the context of God's hand being involved with everything under the sun. Look at verse 16. He writes, And moreover, I saw under the sun the place of judgment, that wickedness was there. And I saw under the sun the place of righteousness, that iniquity was there. We're going to see here in verse 16 the realization of Solomon. Once he really put all of this together for us, he's going to tell you in a very transparent way what he saw that concerned him. Because he saw everything. Remember, he said, I've seen it all. He says, I've seen the place of judgment. I've seen the courtroom. I've seen the prosecutor. I've seen the defense attorney. I've seen the jury. I've seen the judge. I've seen it all. And I've realized that wickedness is in the place of justice. He says, I've looked in the place of righteousness. I've been in the temple. I've been in the tabernacle. I've seen the priesthood. I've seen the Levites. I've seen the scribes. And yes, I've seen that iniquity was there. He's seen it all. That's why he wrote in Proverbs, to have respect of persons is not good. For a piece of bread a man will transgress, referring to bribes. He says in Proverbs 17, a wicked man taketh a gift out of the bosom to pervert the ways of judgment. He's seen men bribing judges. He's seen attorneys corrupted. He's seen priests and Levites corrupted. And his realization was this: injustice is a part of life under the sun. This is an important realization that he's sharing with you and me. Because he just got done saying that there's a time for everything, and there's a purpose for everything, and there's a time to die, a time to be born, and he goes through all that list, and he says, by the way, God's got his hand in everything. And it's beautiful in his time. And you can't figure it out, but you should enjoy life and fear God. And he's talking about God in the midst of all these unchanging cycles of life. But if you're listening, if you're reading, then you're proposed with a dilemma. Because if you look out into the world and you say, all right, so God has his hand on everything, then why is there so much injustice? This is that age-old argument. Well, if God's who you say he was, then why are little children being starved to death? If God is who he says he is, then why are people dying of cancer? If God is who he says he is, then why are children being kidnapped? Why are women being violated? And the list goes on of the injustices of this world. Now, that's why this passage would be misunderstood to be a basis for Calvinism. To use this passage to say that God has predetermined when you're going to be born, how you're going to live, your ups and your downs, your good and your bad, and when you're going to die. To teach that, as many do, you run into a great theological dilemma. Because if God is behind everything in my world, if God is behind everything in my life, then what kind of God is He? If He allows, in fact, orchestrates injustice. Because you say, your Bible says, that God is just. Amen? Then why do I look in the place of judgment and I see wickedness there? Why do I look in the place of righteousness and see iniquity there? Great question, Solomon. There is no denying the existence of injustice in our world, is there? In fact, I would declare it to be a rampant level of injustice. Innocent people are murdered simply because they had something or someone else wanted. Righteous people are killed simply because they are in the wrong place at the wrong time. Good people are robbed because someone was stronger than them. Pure women are violated because they weren't as strong as a particular man. Innocent children are stolen because no one was there to protect them for a brief moment. People are sold into slavery because there are buyers and not enough enforcers. People are wrongly convicted for crimes because there are corrupt attorneys or incompetent judges. People are abused and harassed by wolves in sheep's clothing in places of worship. Being righteous doesn't exempt anyone from the injustice of this world. Minding your own business doesn't dismiss you from the injustice of this world. Loving your neighbor doesn't protect you from the injustice of this world. It's a pretty accurate description, wouldn't you say? Solomon saw it all. Solomon saw the rich and the poor, the good and the bad. He saw the judges. He saw the priests. He noticed that injustice is universal. It can happen to anyone. It does happen to anyone and everyone. He saw injustice where it shouldn't have been in the place of justice. He saw wickedness where it shouldn't have been in the place of righteousness. And being the student of humanity that he was, he looked back in time and he saw injustice rear its ugly head when Cain killed his brother Abel. He saw injustice when Judah promised his daughter-in-law, who was a widow, that he would give her his son when he grew to be of age, but didn't do that. He saw injustice when Joseph, minding his own business, was taken by his 10 older brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery. He saw injustice when Joseph, a good man, minding his own business, was accused of rape, convicted of rape he did not do. He saw injustice by his own father, who stole another man's wife, and in order to cover it up, killed him. He saw injustice in his own uncle, who raped his aunt, and Dad did nothing about it. Solomon saw injustice. He saw it in pagan people, and he saw it in God's people. He saw it in the place of criminality, and he saw it in the place of judgment. He realized what we should realize. Injustice is a part of life under the sun. But in verse 17, we see his response. And to clarify that he is not blaming God for the unavoidable injustices of this world, he shares his inner feelings in response to his realization. He says in verse 17, I said in mine heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked. God shall judge the righteous and the wicked. For the person who may misinterpret his earlier words in chapter 3 to mean in any way that God is behind everything under the sun, he makes it clear that God is not the orchestrator of injustice. God is not in the business of injustice. That's man's problem. Justice is the work of God. Solomon remembered the famous prayer of his forefather Abraham when peering down into Sodom and knowing that God was about to destroy Sodom and knowing Lot and his family were there. And Abraham said to God famously, shall not the God of all the earth do right? You're just. You won't do any wrong. Yes, God allows injustice because God has allowed for our free will. God allows for injustice in our world because we have chosen with our free will to kick God out of it. And so injustice does reign in our world. Indeed, God can even use injustice in this world because He knows how to turn something ugly into something beautiful. And so He writes in verse 17, I said in mine heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. He's referencing verse 1. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven. He's referring to life here. Yes, injustice is a part of man's world under the sun. But understand, dear reader, that justice comes from above the sun. And it comes in time. It comes in God's time. God allows for man's injustice even in the place of judgment and in the place of righteousness. But He only allows it for a time. Because there is a time for injustice, and there will be a time for justice. God shall judge the righteous and the wicked. To every purpose there is a time. To everything there is a season. Nothing is permanent. Remember, everything is temporary. Injustice, too, is temporary. Injustice, too, is not permanent. Maybe you've come to the awful realization that injustice is a part of life under the sun. Maybe you're a victim of injustice. Maybe your loved one is a victim of injustice. Well, Solomon saw the same thing, and he responded with sound theology and said, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked. He said, there is a time here for justice. And so I encourage you, the reader, the listener tonight, to remember what Solomon realized, and that is this: injustice won't last forever. Justice will be served. It will be served by God. It will be served in His time, and when it's done in His time, it will be beautiful. It may be your daughter. It may be your son. It may be your spouse. It may be your parent. It may be your friend. You know, it may just be a stranger you see on the news who is treated so unjustly. Don't get a sour taste about God. You can get a sour taste about this world, but not about God. Be not deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever man soweth, that shall he also reap. There is a time here for judgment. Now, I believe Solomon writes about this on the back of what he said in verses 1 through 15, because there are fewer things that we wrestle with more intensely than injustice. As you know, I love watching criminal shows and detective shows and whatnot, and I have watched the victims of these crimes essentially put a stop on their life. They pause their life until justice is served. And I am in no way blaming them. There is an insatiable thirst within this human spirit for justice. When there is a murder, when there is a kidnapping, when there is theft, when there is robbery, when there is abuse, when there is a sexual activity or there is kidnapping of some sort, the loved ones who are hurt, the loved ones who are victims of that injustice, they stop until justice is served. They always go to the courtroom, the reporters, and they always get there after the conviction type of interview, and they always say, now I can rest. It doesn't bring back my loved one. It doesn't take away the pain. But now I can go on, knowing he's in prison, knowing she's behind bars. There is something within us that we long for justice. People allow it to steal days, to steal years even from their lives. Every day without that justice being served is a ruined day. It's a dark day, because this insatiable thirst for justice cripples us. But we, as Solomon, need to remember that justice belongs to God, and it belongs to God in His time. The psalmist said, O Lord God, to whom vengeance belongeth, O God, to whom vengeance belongeth, show thyself. That's Psalm 94:1. There is a time for justice. And maybe that's what Solomon's referring to in verse 3. Look at verse 3. What's the first phrase of verse 3 say? A time to kill. Now that may be referring to just the generic, when the sacrifices need to be killed, there's a time to kill them. But have you ever thought that list pertains bad things because there are bad people that need consequences? You know, God has committed the authority to nations to execute vengeance on other nations in His behalf. And when there is war, there is killing. And there may be a time to kill because there is a time for justice. God believed in capital punishment from Genesis 9 on. There is a time to kill. It's when man takes a life. See, justice is embedded in that list. And there is a time of war, verse 8. Again, being the student of humanity that he was, Solomon saw justice in the history of man. He saw Cain be judged for the slaying of Abel. He saw Judah humbled for not giving his son to Tamar. He saw God address Joseph's brothers for selling him into slavery. He saw God judge the Egyptians in the Red Sea for their treatment of Israel. And he saw God judge his father for his crimes against Uriah. Solomon has seen in the past that judgment comes from God, and it comes in time. Look at verse 18. We see Solomon's request. He says in verse 18, I said in mine heart, after seeing all this, after contemplating everything, after concluding that God is the judge, I said in mine heart concerning the estate of the sons of men, that God might manifest them, that God might expose them, and that they might see that they themselves are beasts. Now be careful to conclude what so many commentators conclude, that Solomon has lost it. He's equating a man with a beast, and he's saying they're one and the same. That's how far he's gone. That's how depressed he is. That's how far backslidden he is from God. That's not at all what he's saying. He's not saying that men are equivalent to beasts. It's within the context of the injustice that reigns in this world and the judgment that God will bring down on men. And he says, I said in my heart, God, I hope you expose mankind and show that they are just like animals within this context. Verse number 19. This is what he means. For that which befalleth the sons of men befalleth beasts. Even one thing befalleth them. As the one dieth, as animals die, so dieth the other. So do people. Yea, they all have one breath. So that a man hath no preeminence above a beast, for all is vanity. Remember what vanity means in our passage, in our book? Temporary. Animals and mankind, they're all temporary. They all have one thing that keeps them under the sun. It's a little bit of air in their lungs. All die. An animal gets hit by the car, boom, deer's done. Life is over. If you and I run out in front of a car, same thing's going to happen. We're not above a beast. We don't get 9 lives. We don't get extra lives. We don't have a greater body to stay alive. We're all very frail, very temporary. Solomon's saying, oh God, expose man. He thinks he's above the law. He thinks he's above nature even. Show him that he's just as frail as any other creature. He's just as frail as the ant. Life is short for animals. Life is short for people. Verse 20. He said, all go unto one place. What's he referring to? Be careful to put words in his mouth. He's referring to verse number 20. All are of the dust, and all turn to dust again. He's not equating the soul of man to the soul of a beast in any way. He's saying we're all the same from the standpoint of being alive. We're all frail. We're all temporary. We have breath that keeps us here. Once we lose it, we're gone. Our body drops, and just like a carcass on the side of the road, the reality is it decays the same way. Worms destroy this body the same way it does an animal. Okay? We're all on the same page with what Solomon's saying, right? I won't take you there because we're running short on time, but Solomon had a dad who essentially prayed the same prayer. In Psalm 39:4, David said, Lord, make me to know mine end and the measure of my days, what it is, that I may know how frail I am. Behold, thou hast made my days as an handbreadth, and mine age is as nothing before thee. Verily, every man at his best state is altogether vanity. Sound a lot like Solomon's writing, doesn't it? David wasn't bitter. He was trying to get a hold of God. Solomon's not bitter here. He's trying to help us understand we have a God who is about to judge us for our injustice. Verse 21. Who knoweth the spirit of man that goeth upward, and the spirit of the beast that goeth downward to the earth? You see, mankind and the animal kingdom are the same. We have life here. It's temporary. It's fragile. When we die and our air exits our lungs, our body goes back to the dust. The only difference between man and beast is our spirit goes upward. He doesn't mean to be in heaven when we die. He means to be accountable to the Creator when we die. Where the spirit of beast goes downward into the earth, there is no accountability with animals. The spirit of an animal goes back into the earth in the realm of nature, but the spirit of man, we're going up to God. Remember, the context is verse 17, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked. There is a time. There is a time. Solomon's request is this, that man would realize that justice comes sooner than he thinks. This is a lesson that Solomon wanted his fellow man to learn, his friends to learn, his enemies to learn. He wanted everyone to learn this. And this lesson is both inspiring and liberating. If we learn this lesson, that we are frail, that we are going to see God someday, and someday sooner than we think, well, then we will be more conscious of our activity. We will be far less prone to be unjust towards people, knowing we're going to answer for our injustices. But even more so, the liberating truth in this passage is this. Stop caring so much about justice being served on your behalf. The person you want God to judge, the people you want God to judge, leave it to God. It's coming sooner than they think. Give up the why. Give up the when. And that leads to number 4, this great recommendation in verse 22. He writes finally in verse 22, wherefore I perceive that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his, everybody say that word. All right, some of you said 2 words, that'll work. Own, O-W-N, works. Now, it's easy to brush over that and just say, okay, he wants us to be happy for what we have. Careful. The passage is dealing with injustice. You know what he's saying? Stop caring so much about that person. Stop caring about what God does or doesn't do to the other person. Rejoice in your own works. Read on. For that is his portion. For who shall bring him to see what shall be after him? When I first read this, as I was going through the passage and praying about the interpretation and the meaning, my first instinct after reading that question where he says, who's going to bring someone back to see what happens after he dies? My first instinct was chapter 1 and 2, Solomon's obsession with what happens to his stuff after he dies. We've read that and how he was so concerned about Rehoboam taking his estate and what's going to happen. That was my first instinct until I prayed about it and let the Spirit of God show me that has nothing to do with possessions. This is about injustice. You and I may die tomorrow. Guess what you don't care about anymore? That injustice you've been waiting for. And Solomon's saying, ain't nobody bringing you back to see what God does or doesn't do. You're wasting hours worrying about getting out of God what you want to get out of God, when you just need to rejoice in your own works, that which you are responsible for, the only thing you can impact and change and control. Rejoice in your own works. Stop whining about what God isn't doing in someone else's life, because that's your portion. There's a time for everything in life. But we don't control that. That's not up to us. God can do what he wants, when he wants, however he wants, wherever he wants, to whomever he wants, because he is God. You know what we do in closing? We allow the injustices of life to rob us of the blessings of life. We miss out on what we do know about God by fretting about what we do not know about God. And here is Solomon's recommendation. You should write it down. It's that important. He essentially is saying, don't let what you don't understand destroy what you can enjoy. I don't do that. We do this when we're children, and we don't stop doing it when we're adults. But he has something better than me. Take a trip to India, to Africa, to South America. Yeah, your neighbor may have a steak, and you have a hamburger here in America. But your hamburger in America makes the bugs in somebody else's country look like steak. Well, we do this. Well, you haven't judged them, God. Well, you haven't done what I've asked you to do, and all the while missing out on the opportunities to rejoice in our own work. By fretting over why God won't serve you a plate of justice right now, we miss out on the buffet of blessings we already have. We spiritually starve ourselves when sitting next to a buffet of God's blessings because we want something we cannot have. It goes back to that insatiable thirst for justice. What a tragedy to see a Christian fail to see the beauty in God's works because they can't get past the mystery of God's works. I have to say this. I think it's important for us all to hear it. But if you need God to avenge you in order for you to bless Him, then you're a slave to your thirst for justice. Did you get that? Now you're sitting there thinking, well, that's not me because no one's done anything wrong to me. I'm talking about your ex-husband, your ex-wife, your mother, your daughter, talking about your son-in-law, talking about your boss, talking about your coworker, talking about your neighbor. Oh yeah, the people in your life today that you're holding a grudge against until you see God humble them or judge them or punish them. And if you have to have that happen for you to release your power, your control over that situation, then you're no different than Asaph. Asaph almost fell prey to his own thirst for justice. He said in Psalm 73, as for me, my feet were almost gone. My steps had well nigh slipped, for I was envious at the foolish when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. And he goes on to detail how he just couldn't handle God not punishing the wicked. Why? God wouldn't take away the wealth of the unrighteous. And read that chapter because he says, it wasn't until I came into the congregation and I realized that God will do it when He wants, how He wants, but it will be done. I'm not God. And Asaph released that thirst for whatever it is you want to be done. I will finish with Joseph. Joseph is probably the greatest example of injustice in the Bible. Would you agree? Yes? Sold by his brothers into slavery. Then he was falsely accused and convicted and imprisoned. Then while in prison, he was left by the guy who was supposed to remind the Pharaoh that he was down there. His whole life, at least as a young man, was a life of injustice. But I read Joseph, and I don't read him as a slave to injustice or a thirst of justice. When he's in Potiphar's house, to me, he seems like a happy guy. He's made steward over the whole house of Pharaoh. He's not whining and complaining about it. And when Potiphar's wife comes to him, he says, how can I do this great wickedness against your husband and against God? Dude, your boss is like, oh, I don't know, your master unjustly? Like, you belong back in Canaan. But he didn't have any bitterness. He embraced his position. He gets thrown into jail. While he's in jail, he becomes the boss of the prisoners. He wasn't sitting in the corner sucking his thumb with a can of worms and saying, God, I'm not moving until you judge them all. He embraced his position. It is what it is. When he was lifted out of the dungeon and he interprets Pharaoh's dream, Pharaoh raises him to second in the nation. He's the prime minister. I don't want the crown. I don't want the jewels until God judges my brothers. And Potiphar's wife. And the butler, the baker. I always forget which one's alive. Right? No, he embraces the fame. He embraces the wealth. He embraces marriage. He gets married. He has 2 children. And he names one of his child a name that means God hath made me to forget all my toil. What I'm saying is Joseph didn't let that injustice stop him from rejoicing in his own works. He said, it's my portion. I'm not the judge. God will deal with it in his time and his way. But what's handed to me, I'll embrace and make the best out of it. And as a result, he would see justice. But he actually didn't want to see justice by then. Right? Who were the guys that were unjust? His brothers? When they finally came to him? Fear not, brethren. I will take care of you. God, don't judge them. See, when we let go of our thirst for justice, we can rejoice in our own work. And the beautiful thing is, we just don't want justice anymore. We give it to God and trust him with it. That's what Solomon's saying in chapter 3. This man is not off his rocker. He's on his game, inspired by the Holy Spirit, and he's trying to encourage us. He's trying to help us. Oh, what a precious book it is. Let's stand. I've got you too late anyways. Let's have a word of prayer.